BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, why this year's spring flush is causing problems.
Easter's particularly late. That means that it has landed at the same time as that good grass growth. Secondly, the two bank holidays, they change consumer buying habits. So it does mean that demand alters slightly. Some factories were unable to process all of the milk that they received.
More on that later. First though, a couple who ran an organic dairy farm in Nottinghamshire for decades have swapped their dairy cows for trees. Deborah and Tom Willoughby have started an agroforestry project which qualifies for government funding. They say planting crops alongside fruit and nut trees now makes sense for their finances and for the environment, as the BBC East Midlands environment correspondent Sally Bowman reports.
We've mainly planted apple trees, but we've also got walnut trees, we've got hazelnuts, and we've got some pear trees and a few plums.
Deborah Willoughby now nurtures baby trees instead of baby dairy calves. After nearly 30 years, she and her husband Tom decided to give up their organic dairy near Normanton-on-Soar in Nottinghamshire.
We just found that we were just kind of never going to get out of debt, really. When things were good, they were really good, and you'd never quite get out of debt, and then things would go bad again, and the milk price would drop, and we'd be back to having to borrow money again.
The couple are still breeding calves, but for beef, not dairy. Today the herd is enjoying a meal of homegrown winter silage. The farm also grows oats and barley. Agroforestry, that's planting trees right next to crops, is having a bit of a moment right now. Fans say it hugely reduces soil erosion and boosts fertility. It soaks up carbon and gives farmers more products to sell. There's even a cash sweetener in the form of government funding of £10,000 for every hectare of newly planted woodland. So why aren't more farmers doing it?
Maybe it's because it's an unknown and they're unsure about it, but maybe as people learn and see that it is achievable, that it can be profitable, and maybe it can help your business at those times when, if there is a drought and one crop doesn't come, then you've got two crops in the field that you can harvest.
I think farm incomes are under such pressure that people are having to look at alternatives, and this is one of the alternatives, and it's all positive, and we will see where it all leads us.
These apple saplings, including heritage varieties, will mostly go for juicing. The Willoughbys expect to start harvesting their first crop this autumn.
Let's turn to our subject for the week, pulses. We grow quite a lot here in the UK and most go into animal feed. But with changing consumer tastes and a changing climate, farmers are also trying to grow things like chickpeas and lentils, with varied results, as we'll hear this week. Well, for a sense of what's possible and what's profitable, I spoke to Michael Shuldham, head of pulses at breeding company NPZ.
In real scale, the major pulse we grow is faba beans. In addition to that, we grow different types of combining peas, which are green, yellow and marrowfat peas, which you might more recognise from the shelves of the supermarket.
And am I right in thinking most of this is for animal feed?
Yeah, in the UK, our major use is animal feed. High quality crops, and particularly marrowfat peas, we export a lot of them for human consumption, and some of them are used in the UK for human consumption. Faba beans, which are our most widely grown pulse, primarily are used in animal feed in the UK, but really good samples are exported to Egypt and North Africa for human consumption. It's just something that's not really super popular in the UK at the moment. It's sort of a mission of several people as well as myself to change.
Because you can eat fava beans as a snack, really, can't you? Kind of dried and spiced.
Yeah, there's some really good fava bean snacks available from UK fava bean producers, but you can also eat them soaked. I have them in a lot of stews, curries and other dishes.
We're going to talk later in the week about the small growth at the moment in trying to grow things like lentils, carlin peas, even chickpeas. How much is that the future for pulses here in the UK?
I think it's definitely part of it. I always like to see more work going on into testing and trialling new pulses. I don't think we should forget that some of the pulses that we already do grow outperform in many ways some of these new types that are more accepted. So something like a faba bean has higher protein, higher dietary fibre than a chickpea. We are very good at growing fava beans. They're well acclimatised to our maritime climate, whereas chickpeas, they tend to have a very short growing season in hotter countries. But the trialling and testing work is looking at changing the life of that variety so it can be planted into cooler conditions and harvested earlier is the major aim.
Are pulses, generally speaking, an attractive crop for farmers? Do they make enough money on them?
I think it's one of the big challenges of growing pulses. Farmers are having a tough time at the moment. Where you look at 1 year gross margins at the moment, it's difficult to make many crops stack up, to be honest. What pulses offer is cheaper inputs. You're not buying expensive nitrogen, but also it's where they sit in a rotation. So as part of a whole farm rotation, where you're putting a nitrogen fixing crop in and potentially 0.8 tonne a hectare uplift on your following wheat crop, when you're attributing those sort of benefits back to the pulse crop, they're a really important part of a farmer's rotation, and lengthening rotations is a really important part of regenerative agriculture, and pulses definitely have a very good part to play in that.
So they can come in between a more profitable cereal crop. So you do cereals, pulses, cereals, say, and that way you're giving something back to that field.
Yeah, that's right. And I think wheat follows global markets, whereas pulses don't tend to. So it's also diversifying that risk on farm as to what crops you're growing.
Michael Shuldham, more on pulses all week. Dairy farmers are being advised to cull or sell cows or reduce their feed as processors around the country struggle with high volumes of milk. The spring flush has been particularly good this year, with cows put out to grass earlier, and that's meant they're producing more milk. But dairies can't cope, and some are warning that while they'll pay the agreed price for the contracted amount of milk, any extra will be bought at a much lower price. The National Farmers Union Dairy Board Chair and Yorkshire dairy farmer, Paul Tompkins, told me we haven't had such a big spring flush for a while.
The spring flush is just our cows responding to good conditions. They're not like robots, they are living animals, and the amount of milk that they produce responds to different factors. So one of them being great grass growth, what we're really good at in the UK, but it means that when spring comes and grass is looking lush and green, that means that our cows that are grazing it start to produce a bit more milk.
And this does happen most years, doesn't it? So why is it a problem this year?
Yeah, well, it's the return of the spring flush 2025. Well, like I said, it was there last year. It was dampened by that horrible wet winter and long winter into the spring months, if you remember last year. Before that, things were slightly odd because demand was very much in flux as a result of the Ukraine and COVID and the cost of living, all of those inflationary factors which had an impact. And AHDB's most recent figures show that we're producing about 7.5% more milk than we did this time last year. And actually, anecdotally, from last weekend, I was told by processors that they were seeing volumes about 10% higher than the year before.
And dairies do seem to be struggling with that much milk.
Yes, I think that if we mix in a few factors, we can see why there might be particular strain this year. So Easter's particularly late, and that means that it has landed at the same time as that good grass growth. Secondly, the 2 bank holidays, they change consumer buying habits. You know, the shops are closed at certain times and open at others. People are doing different things over the Easter holidays. So it does mean that demand alters slightly. And then you chuck into that mix factory issues that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, combine that all together, and I think we've just seen a bit more of an acute problem over the Easter weekend when, like you say, some factories were unable to process all of the milk that they received.
One Devon dairy has been advising its farmers to cull or sell cows, which does seem extreme.
What's important is that dairy farmers and their processors work carefully together to understand when there is most desire for their milk and when there's less. It's always been my view that actually the way in which that happens should be left to the autonomy of the dairy farmer, as they know best what's happening on their farm.
There is a financial aspect to this, isn't there? Because you might be contracted to a dairy to provide a certain amount of milk at one price, but any extra will be paid at a different, and dairies are now warning, lower price.
In an attempt to send the right market signals to farmers, some dairies have introduced ways of, like you say, of paying less money when there is more volume about, so-called beef litres or seasonality. That works in some circumstances. What it does do, though, is the effects of the price are happening right now, which is a bit late for planning. I'd much rather see more advance notice. And the other thing that I think that makes that seasonality style payments more tolerable is if in the autumn months, when we have lower milk volumes, then we see the market returns on farm at that time.
On a purely practical level, on a dairy farm, if you're in the middle of the spring flush and the dairies start saying, well, we don't really want this milk, what can you actually do?
You're right, it's difficult because cows don't respond. I can't go out and have a chat with them tonight and see if they're feeling different tomorrow. The reality is that the cow is going to respond to the good conditions around her. We can do small things. We can, our cows have annual holidays when they're dried off. We can perhaps extend those a bit, or we can, those that are due to be leaving our herd later in the year, we could bring that forward. But the reality is that the cow is looking to respond to the good conditions that she sees around her at the moment.
Paul Tompkins. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.